Most notably, this budget scales back the federal investment in the Great Lakes ecosystem. Funding for the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative is reduced by 90%. Asian carp control and prevention is cut by $5.1 million. Harmful algal bloom research is cut by $2.3 million. These programs and more are important not only to my constituents, but to the constituents of many of my colleagues around this table. I will be working with my colleagues, and particularly my chair, in the coming weeks to ensure that these programs continue. Although funding for this program resides with the EPA's budget, it's been understood from the beginning the funds are to be coordinated and shared with other agencies. With that in mind, can you tell us whether the department was consulted in the decision to cut the funding for the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative?
No, the department was not consulted, Mr. Joyce. When the executive branch put together its budget, it's a very siloed operation, so EPA's conversations are with OMB, and Interior is not consulted or informed about those discussions. Similarly, EPA doesn't know what's happening with the Interior budget formulation. So we had no conversations about EPA's budget.
Well, what are some of the examples of the work that the department does or is currently doing with GLRI funding that would not be continued in fiscal year FY20 if the proposed cut were to be enacted?
Okay, there are a number of activities going on. The Fish and Wildlife Service, for instance, was involved in research and some restoration grants for fisheries habitat and wildlife habitat in the western edge of Lake Erie. There were some grants for Kirtland's warbler and eastern Massasauga rattlesnake restoration, about $350,000 in non-federal matching contributions. And our U.S. Geological Survey also tends to be a fairly significant recipient historically of Great Lakes Restoration Initiative funding.
The Interior's budget proposal, as you know, investment in recent years in Asian carp control and prevention now easily numbers in the tens of millions of dollars. Would you please take a minute to update the subcommittee on the accomplishments to date with these recent investments in Asian carp control and prevention and your objectives for fiscal year 20 then?
Yes, Mr. Joyce, I'll be happy to do that. As you observed, we've got about $13.5 million in the President's budget for Interior for Asian carp. A good deal of that money has gone to the U.S. Geological Survey. There's been some really interesting research on environmental DNA, so-called eDNA, that enables us to identify where organisms are just by doing water samples. Another example is that we've been looking at U.S. Geological Survey has identified larval grass carp eggs in the Maumee River and in Toledo. And if grass carp get into the Great Lakes, and as you know, there are half a dozen species of Asian carp, but one of the particular threats of grass carp is they eat aquatic vegetation, and not only does that disrupt the ecosystems, but that also means they eat the food for ducks and other aquatic birds that are very important to waterfowl hunters and bird watchers. So the grass carp risk is a particularly significant one. USGS.
I consider it game, set, match if they get into the green.
It would be really bad. There's a $7 billion fishery at stake here, as I know, Mrs. Lawrence and the other members of the subcommittee are very much aware, and that has very significant implications for Michigan's boating industry, tourism, all sorts of things. So it's a very significant issue. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, for the past two budget cycles, our colleagues here, and we certainly welcome Ms. Lawrence to the Great Lakes, colleagues here on this, provided funding to the Fish and Wildlife Service for contract fishery on Asian carp. We did this in direct response to actions called for in management plans. Mm-hmm. God forbid these things get in the Great Lakes, but we'd really be better off at catching them. Right now, unfortunately, the Mississippi River Basin offers plenty of opportunity to do so. Could you take a minute and update us on what the subcommittee, update the subcommittee on what the Fish and Wildlife's efforts to start a contract fishery for Asian carp?
Yes, absolutely, Mr. Joyce. So we are focusing at the leading edge of the invasion, if you will, to try to deplete the the populations at the leading edge before they can get as massive as they are in some of the larger rivers. And while the long-term goal, of course, is to eradicate the carp, having a commercial fishery is one of many tools to at least get some of them out of the water. We're working closely with state agencies to manage this effort and to try to engage with commercial fishing operations.